Hi, my name is Tayo Adekunle. I'm a photographer currently based in Edinburgh. Welcome to my solo exhibition. Upstairs, we have works from a series that I've made called Venus Noire. It's a collection of images which responds to different aspects of how Black women are seen and portrayed historically and in a contemporary context. There were a few things I wanted to talk about in this project. Firstly, the lack of representation of Black people in the arts and the attitudes that this signaled. I also wanted to talk about how Black women are often viewed as hypersexual, but also grotesque at the same time. So I used the goddess Venus to look at this. So the Venus is a figure of beauty, particularly in the Western world. She is white, and therefore she upholds a standard of beauty that's inaccessible to anyone who isn't white. I definitely wanted to recognize how beauty does not only come from whiteness. And sort of once I'd figured this out within myself, I found so much within my own body and the bodies of other Black women to celebrate. In a lot of these images, you'll see that I've worn my natural afro hair out as well. This image was inspired by Manet's Olympia and Titian's Venus of Urbino. So I also used overdrawn lips to feature throughout the series, sort of to nod to blackface and minstrelsy. I knew about blackface and minstrelsy before I'd started this series, but I discovered the character of Jim Crow and I wanted to look at him a little bit deeper. So he is a Black caricature that embodies many of the stereotypes of Black people. And so I really wanted to nod to blackface within the photographs, especially as it's an issue that we still deal with today. Blackface characters traditionally depict Black people as being stupid or as ugly. So for me, I wanted to use the red lips to acknowledge but also reject all the stereotypes that blackface represents. And I also wanted the images to be a little bit uncomfortable as well. So still in keeping with the Venus sort of idea, this image was inspired by Do Darcy's Venus statue. So with Mammy, I was sort of still continuing my research about the sexualization of Black women, and I came across the Mammy figure. And she was very important to me because it showed the multiple sides in the perceptions and representations of Black females. For me, she sort of worked in opposition to the other stereotypes I'd seen, where hypersexuality was at the forefront, as she showed how Black women were also being desexualized. Typically, the Mammy is devoid of sexuality and she takes no pleasure for herself. And yeah, so she sort of showed to me how Black women could be hypersexualized and desexualized at the same time, and how we can often be considered desirable and grotesque at the same time. This is two women. So one of the things that I'm also sort of talking about and looking at in this series is identity, or the lack of identity given to Black women, and how that identity can be robbed through these kinds of stereotypes. So on the right of these two images, you have a woman with overdrawn lips, again pointing towards the Black face and Black stereotyping, but you can't see her face, and therefore I guess she doesn't really have an identity. And then on the left is an image of me with my hair out and wearing jewelry, sort of like personal adornment. So there's an indication of my identity and who I am in this image. And I kept the overdrawn lips in this one just to still point to how these stereotypes can still be put on me as an individual. I drew round lips just to make the reference to blackface explicitly clear, because a lot of the times through like source imagery and stuff, blackface was shown with rounded lips. However, this sort of linked to the trend of overdrawing lips within like the beauty industry, and as a makeup thing. And so this sort of points to big lips can be seen as desirable or beautiful on a white face, but then when it's seen on the face of a Black person, it's seen as less desirable or something that we should hide. So yeah, I think with the pointy lips, I was still referencing blackface, but I was also showing the link between that and yeah, sort of like beauty standards. I think through the research that I'd done, I'd learned where certain perceptions of my own body that I had come from, and why those had been taught to me and to other Black girls like me. And so once I sort of realized where those things had come from, it made me realize that the things that I thought about myself were completely false and wrong. Also, seeing other Black women talking about the same things that I was talking about just helped me really appreciate my own body and my hair and the way that I looked and just various different aspects. I think it was also very therapeutic to sort of be editing pictures of my own body, because I knew I definitely didn't want to sort of overly Photoshop them or retouch them or anything. Like, they weren't meant to be fashion images. And so, especially in the Crouching Venus one, I'm so exposed. So it was quite nice to sort of just like stop editing it at one point. I think there was a point where I definitely went too far, and then I basically just restarted again, because I was just like, I want to keep these looking as natural as possible, and just accepting the way that my body looked was very freeing. Reclamation of the Exposition is my graduate project. It explores and responds to the fetishization, quantification, and sexualization of the Black female body. I look at colonial photography and the displays of Black bodies at world fairs and in natural history museums. The work within this series continues my exploration of how the Black body was turned into a spectacle. The project sort of came about hand in hand with my dissertation work, where I was looking at world fairs and colonial photography. Reclamation of Exposition 1 was the first image that I'd made. I'd seen a lot of images that showed sort of the sexualization and exoticization through like colonial photography. I was especially inspired by Prince Royal Napoleon Bonaparte's collection called Boschman et Hottentot, which I directly used in works, which you'll later see. So in a lot of the images, women were left unnamed with vague and sometimes inaccurate descriptions of their nationality, and they were often photographed naked in front of plain backgrounds or in sort of staged settings, and they were often photographed in a way that emphasized this nakedness. So I'd taken poses from these colonial photographs I'd found within my research and adapted them for my work. I'd seen quite a few reclining images which had sort of clear sexual connotations, which would seem inappropriate for ethnographic work. However, as I sort of later learned, that these images were circulated as, well, often circulated as pornographic postcards, and were sort of only allowed to do that because of the supposed sort of research status of the images that were being taken. And so it was clear that they were sort of, the pieces were only being disguised as educational or ethnographic imagery. I definitely wanted to sort of counter this idea of, I don't know, like the lack of identity given to these women within the images. So I used Nigerian fabric as the background of the pieces to sort of signal towards my own background and my heritage. Yeah, I think, I was just putting my own body on display rather than the bodies of others. So these three images are all sort of inspired by the same style of photography, which was anthropometric style photography. So this was used as a more convenient and alternative way to the more rigid style of photography that was used, where bodies were photographed alongside a measuring scale, and then they were posed in front, side, and back profiles, and then often with their arms out as well, so that you could measure their bodily proportions. So in anthropometric style photography, the photographers would place multiple bodies in one frame and position them so that various angles of the bodies could be shown. You'd often see front, side, back profiles along with seated positions, so that direct comparison between the different bodies could be made. Again, these figures were often naked, and these images were also circulated as postcards, which further sexualized these women. For these ones, again, I sort of just took poses that I'd seen coming up quite frequently in like source material. I think I'd seen a lot of the one with where I've got my arms above my head, and also ones where women were seated and they had their hands like by their faces. I think, again, that was almost like, seemed like that was a way for them to get some sort of scale for various different features or something. So yeah, I sort of just shot a bunch of different poses and then I guess, just sort of formed an image from the poses that I had. I think with the material that I've used as well in both of these images, so Reclamation of Exposition 3 has a scale on it, which points towards like the measurement of these bodies, and also like the horizontal lines that feature in all three of those, I think just reminded me of this sort of measuring scale that was, I guess it was almost like an invisible measuring scale that was meant to be in those images or was sort of being removed from these images. So with the size of these works, I wanted them to be almost sort of life size. So I had initially planned for these to be put in antique display cabinets, as if they were being on display at a museum. So I needed them to be large scale because I wanted it to feel like there was a real person inside those cabinets, sort of referencing to this display of human bodies and things like human zoos and stuff like that. I think even now, when they're not in these cases, I still want it to feel like it's almost like a real person that's in front of you there, to create this idea of a spectacle and to draw like the viewer's attention. Again, still referencing just the way that Black people were treated in the past at these kinds of exposition shows. With this series, I sort of went from photographing the fabric sort of by itself. So it's Nigerian fabric that my mum had sent up to me. And then because of these staged images that I was using as source material, where these women were being photographed in botanical gardens in Paris, I went to the botanical gardens in Edinburgh and I photographed a bunch of plants there. I didn't really make a conscious choice in terms of which plants I photographed, because it was very clear that a conscious choice had not been made as to where to place these women because they weren't being photographed in the places that they came from. So I sort of just went for more of like an aesthetic feel than for anything that had any link to me or my identity or anything like that. Artifacts was sort of a mini series within the larger series of Reclamation of the Exposition. For these ones, I directly used the source material that inspired the entire project, as I wanted people to be able to see firsthand the kind of images that I was referring to. So these images come from a collection of images called Baartman at Hottentot, which was taken by Prince Roland Napoleon Bonaparte. It was one of the only collections of images that I'd found, as many museums' digital archives had not been digitalized. And so they didn't really have any resources relating to colonial history that showed Black people. I was very interested in how these images were staged, but in a way that wasn't meant to seem authentic. These images were taken in gardens of plants in Paris, and so they weren't even photographed in South Africa, which is where these women would have come from. The cloths on the floor of the images and in the background sort of allude to some sort of photo shoot type scene. And yeah, it sort of reiterated how, I guess, like the exotic can sometimes be staged in a way that appeals to European audiences. These women were posed in different ways that emphasize certain sexual features and certain features as well that pointed towards their physical difference. So I placed myself in these images in a way to sort of visually express how the treatment of their bodies and bodies like theirs in the past has informed the way that Black female bodies like my own can be treated today. I included both contemporary clothing, like contemporary Western clothing, as well as wraps made from Nigerian fabric to sort of create this sense of timelessness. The contemporary clothing keeps the images rooted in the present to show how this sort of treatment still occurs today. And then the wraps can be worn at any time, so sort of represent the treatment of women throughout time. So I think I definitely wanted to reclaim sort of the agency of these women within these images. I placed myself alongside them to show how these images related to me and the way that they were seen also related to me and just Black women in general. So where these women lacked agency, I decided to display my body in this way, sort of making eye contact with those who had sexualized them in the past. In terms of relation to like the past and present and the way that Black women were seen in the past and Black women are seen nowadays, I think the basic ideas are almost still there, but the way maybe that it's done is slightly different. There's still this hypersexual idea or this like extreme sexuality that Black women supposedly have. That idea is definitely still there. But I think nowadays you're seeing sort of women taking ownership of that narrative as well. I think women have a lot more agency now. And so there's a lot more freedom to sort of dictate how you're going to be depicted. This is Yemoja. This is the most recent piece of work that I've made. I sort of started making this piece as I was sort of talking about slavery and the inherited trauma of Black people. So, especially with the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, these are things that I think me and a lot of people are thinking about right now. It was inspired by a documentary called Enslaved with Samuel L. Jackson. And it's a BBC documentary where the history of the transatlantic slave trade is explored. And the documentary uses the ocean as a theme throughout to link different countries that were involved in the triangular trade. And then it also uses divers to go to sort of the seabed to find evidence of wrecked slave ships. So there were a lot of ships that had little to no record about them. And it sort of just highlighted again the lack of documentation and archival material that there is when it comes to Black history. While I was watching the documentary, I was sort of making note on various different aspects of the slave trade and various different elements within it. I then made my own versions of some of the artifacts that they'd found. Around my head are these things called manila. So these were manufactured in Birmingham and they were made of brass and they were used as currency in the slave trade. So it could be that one manila could be used as the equivalent to one slave life, but it could also represent like 15 lives or 100 lives, I think, depending on the shape of them. And so this was just a very clear and solid symbol for me about how Black lives can be valued and commodified. I also created my own tusks to show how ivory was used in the trade. So these would have been taken from elephants, and then the ivory was carried by slaves and transported on the boats to the Americas, where it was sold on to be manufactured into things like pianos. I went back to the botanical gardens. I photographed some sugarcane, which would have been farmed in South America and mainly in Brazil. So they were the biggest supplier of sugar throughout the trade. The sugar was farmed by slaves, and then the sugar was then refined and transported back to Europe, along with things like coffee and chocolate and cotton. Another sort of element of this piece is that I'm also looking at Yoruba orishas, just to sort of link back to my own heritage and my background. It was a really nice way to learn more about my culture. So I used the figure of Yemoja, who is a motherly orisha, and she's also a water spirit who has associations with the moon. She's often linked with the image of the Virgin Mary in South American and Afro-Cuban practices. One of her traits is that she is a comforting figure who takes away her children's pain. She's surrounded by elements of a very horrific past, but she is this comforting figure, or represents this comforting figure in and amongst all of these symbols of horrific things. I also sort of combined her with images of or depictions I'd seen of the Virgin Mary. I think I keep using Western art references within my work. It's something that I just keep on doing. And so, yeah, there's sort of like elements of Nigerian cloth in here, the history of slavery, and then, yeah, like Western art history and religious iconography as well.